I remember the moment I realized my marriage was over. It wasn't because I caught him in bed with her. No, that would have been too easy. It was because I walked into my husband's office one morning, bringing him the coffee he always forgot to grab, and saw the look he gave her. A look that used to belong to me. The kind that told a woman she was the only thing keeping his world spinning. That woman was Claire Anderson, his new marketing assistant. And that look was the first crack in the glass house I had spent 10 years building. My name is Emily Carter, and this is the story of how the woman who stole my husband lost everything she had, because I made sure of it. They say when your heart breaks, you can actually feel it. I didn't believe that until the night I found the messages. Not the kind that left room for doubt, no. These were explicit, passionate, and worst of all, familiar. The words he used with her were the same ones he once used with me. Can't wait to taste you again. You make me feel alive. That one stung the most. Because if she made him feel alive, what did that make me? Dead weight. I sat there in the dark, phone in hand, watching the screen blur through my tears. My husband, Michael, asleep upstairs, snoring softly like nothing in the world was wrong. And I sitting on the cold kitchen floor. Finally realized how naive love can make you. I didn't confront him right away. I'm not the kind of woman who screams or throws things. No, I waited. Observed. Collected evidence. Because when I strike, I don't miss. Over the next few weeks, I became an actress in my own marriage, smiling, cooking dinner, even pretending to be interested in his work. I laughed when he told jokes I'd already heard, and kissed him goodnight knowing he'd probably just come from her apartment. Every fake smile I gave was another brick in the wall I was building around my heart. The first time I saw her outside the office was at a charity gala. I didn't know she'd be there. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She looked younger in person, prettier too. Maybe it was the confidence of someone who thought she'd won. When she walked up to us, her perfume hit me before her smile did. Sweet. Overpowering. Like she wanted the whole world to know she'd arrived. Mrs. Carter, she said, holding out her hand. Her eyes flicked to Michael before landing back on me. It's such an honor to finally meet you. Honor. The word twisted in my chest like a knife. But I smiled. Oh, I smiled so sweetly it could have given her cavities. The pleasure's mine, I said. I've heard so much about you. She blushed. Michael looked away. And in that moment I decided she wasn't just going to lose him. She was going to lose everything. Claire had just started climbing the corporate ladder at the firm Michael worked for. Bright, ambitious, full of ideas. Everyone adored her. The higher-ups whispered about her potential for leadership. She had no idea that the woman she betrayed would soon become her biggest obstacle. You see, before I married Michael, I had a career of my own, public relations. Crisis management specifically. My job was to destroy bad press before it destroyed reputations. I knew how scandals worked, how rumors spread, and how quickly admiration turned to disgust. I hadn't used those skills in years. Until now. I started with small things, anonymous tips to gossip blogs about inappropriate relationships within the company. Nothing too direct. Just enough to make HR curious. Then came the whispers. Leaked photos from office events, carefully edited to suggest intimacy between Claire and her boss. Michael didn't even notice the net tightening around them. Every week, I watched her confidence falter a little more. Late-night emails stopped. Smiles at work became forced. I even heard her car got keyed in the parking lot one afternoon. Guilt, suspicion, judgment, one by one they started to eat at her. And I wasn't even close to finished. By the time the investigation started, Michael was a wreck. He couldn't understand why the company's HR department suddenly cared about his mentorship program. He didn't know that I'd fed them every detail they needed to suspect him, and by extension her. But Claire, poor Claire, thought she could talk her way out of it. She tried to play innocent, but the evidence was stacked too perfectly. The late-night texts, the suspicious emails, the photos. HR called it an inappropriate relationship affecting the integrity of the workplace. She was suspended pending review. Michael was placed on leave. And me? I watched from the sidelines as the empire they built on lies started to crumble. One night, Michael came home drunk. Angry, confused, desperate. Someone's setting us up, he shouted. They think I'm having an affair with Claire. I looked at him, calm as ever. Are you? He froze. It's not what you think. Oh, I think it's exactly what I think. I said, stepping closer. And I think you're about to find out what it feels like to lose everything. He left that night, suitcase in hand. Went straight to her apartment. I know because I followed him there. I sat in my car across the street, watching the lights flicker on in her window. Two shadows moving together. Two traitors clinging to each other while the world around them burned. I smiled. It was almost poetic. When HR came to Claire's apartment with a formal complaint, it felt like watching a slow-motion catastrophe. She answered the door with mascara smudged under her eyes, perfectly composed until the first question landed. Then her composure cracked like cheap glass. She tried to spin a story about mentorship, about late nights at the office and an overbearing boss who'd crossed lines. People believe what they want to believe until a pattern appears. The pattern had been my work. I had meticulously built a trail of breadcrumbs, emails with suggestive subject lines I'd manufactured, a leaked calendar entry that implied late-night strategy sessions, a few staged photos from company events that I'd carefully blurred and edited to read as intimacy. HR didn't need absolute proof. They needed plausible deniability to act. That was what I gave them. Claire's suspension became a headline in our small town's business column. Rising star suspended amid scandal. The word star felt like a mocking nickname. Social media lit up. Screenshots of her Instagram, speculative threads, the inevitable moralizing. People loved watching a fall. It's human nature. Michael came to me then, pleading, apologizing, begging me to go to his work to explain that everything was a misunderstanding. He wanted me to stand in front of the board and save him. I laughed, only once, cold and brittle. You broke our vows for a girl in a cubicle, I said. Now you'll watch how fragile your empire is. He stared at me like I had turned into someone foreign, someone dangerous. He didn't go to her rescue. He went to Claire's apartment and begged her to tell HR it was all a mistake. He begged the woman he'd been creeping around with to sacrifice herself for him. She refused. Of course she refused. Why would she throw herself under the bus to save a man who'd already been two-timing her with the woman he'd promised to love? When he came back, eyes rimmed with red, he told me she said no. She said she wasn't going down for him, he whispered. Pride, I thought. Or maybe self-preservation. Or both. I let him stew in it. I let him feel the humiliation. That's part of revenge, letting the target realize their losses slowly, personally. Quick victories are for amateur gladiators. As Claire's suspension dragged, a different war started. The company launched an external audit to see how compliance had been managed. My fingers, long out of practice, danced across the keyboard. I started planting professional doubts about Claire's competence. I leaked an anonymous memo suggesting she'd mismanaged a key client pitch. I sent a doctored slide deck to a small but sharp industry blog that specialized in calling out incompetent managers. The piece was cruelly specific, citing missed deadlines and a pattern of promising far more than she could deliver. People began to question why someone so young had been promoted so quickly. The whispers grew into official concern. Clients pulled back. Her mentor's emails became more formal. The board started asking for performance reviews. I made sure her performance reviews were not boxed in by office politics but framed as a measurable decline. Word traveled fast in corporate corridors. When the external auditors asked for work product, Claire's inbox, meticulously policed by me, contained versions of proposals and pitches that looked amateurish. I'd slipped and forgotten draft files, left intentionally sloppy, with notes indicating missed edits and unclear objectives. The auditors had no reason to doubt. The narrative was coherent. Claire was a liability. At home, Michael was running on autopilot, sleepwalking through a marriage he'd already abandoned. Sometimes he looked at me with pleading in his eyes, as if I could fix what he'd ruined. But I wasn't a fixer. I was an architect of consequences. Each step I took was a blueprint for ruin. There were nights when I lay awake, racked with adrenaline and the taste of victory not yet fully sweetened. I'd jot ideas into a notebook, expose incompetence, apply for role, position as savior. The plan was neat, clinical, like a surgical procedure. I had always done my best work with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The tipping point came at an annual board retreat. Claire was called to present a project she'd led, ironically the very project I'd sabotaged. The boardroom was full of faces I'd known for years. I sat at the back, my coffee gone cold, palms steady. Claire walked in with determination plastered on her face, and a folder of material she believed in. She began to speak. At first she was compelling. Youthful bravado mixed with rehearsed facts. Then the screen flickered and the slides she depended on showed the drafts I'd planted. Typos, mismatched financials, weak KPIs. Her explanation sounded like a broken record. People exchanged glances. One board member's jaw tightened. Another made a note. She fought, tears threatening at her lashes, but it didn't matter. The illusion of competence crumbled, not because she was malicious, but because I'd made sure there were no salvaging narratives left. The board called it a failure in judgment. The CEO, who had publicly praised her a month earlier, quietly asked her to step down from the project. She sat down heavily, the dignity draining from her like water from a burst pipe. I felt nothing in that moment but cold, intense satisfaction. But satisfaction can be an unstable thing. It ripples outward and can turn on the hand that feeds it. Victory tastes like metal in the mouth. I was elated but also surprisingly exhausted. Every late-night email, every doctored document, every anonymous tip required maintenance. Lies require housekeeping. The more I invested, the more the center of my life became the plan. I was no longer Emily, the woman who'd loved, worked, and laughed. I was Emily, the strategist, a ghost haunting the life I'd once had. And then something happened that the plan hadn't accounted for. Claire fought back. She hired a lawyer. A young, sharp woman who smelled of coffee and righteous fury. Claire started to leak her own narrative. Text messages that painted a different picture. References from colleagues who vouched for her character. Witness statements about boundaries being respected. It was the natural counterattack, and I had underestimated her capacity for resilience. A court of public opinion began to form two camps. Some called me a vengeful wife with a talent for PR. Others began to wonder if I'd gone too far. Michael started to look lost in the middle of this war he'd helped create. He reached out to Claire again, pleading for reconciliation. She wanted nothing to do with him. She had dignity left that he could not buy back. Then came the night my house was egged. A message scrawled across my driveway. Karma's a bitch. I knew who'd written it. Possibly one of Claire's defender's friends, someone with a sense of righteous outrage. My immediate reaction was fury. I called Michael. He said he would fix it. He didn't. He watched, perhaps with a sliver of satisfaction, while I scrubbed paint from my porch. Moments like that reveal the human costs. My neighbor's eyes grew colder. Invitations stopped. The PDA president stopped returning my calls. Revenge is public spectacle, and not everyone enjoys being in the front row. I decided to move faster. The slower you let things fester, the more opportunities your enemy has to regain footing. If Claire wanted to play the narrative game, I would become the author. I prepared a dossier, not just about Claire's failings, but a wider narrative linking her promotions to nepotism and favoritism within the company. I dug into public filings, whispered scandals, and performance metrics. I found a handful of executives with skeletons in their closets, people who'd rather keep their secrets private than see another upwardly mobile threat make their own moves. I started subtle conversations with them, a brushstroke at a time. You'd be surprised what a seed can do when it's planted in the right soil. Once the seed starts to sprout, the whole garden can be burned down by panic. I also used one of Claire's brightest assets against her, her image. She'd spent months cultivating a persona online. Community service, panels, smiling headshots. I obtained recordings of off-the-record comments she'd made at a closed focus group, comments that, when clipped and taken out of context, made her seem patronizing and callow. I fed those clips to a podcast host who loved nothing more than a scandal with a moral sheen. Within days, the narrative shifted again. The podcast painted Claire as an opportunist who used progressive platitudes as a stepping stone. People who had once applauded her sincerity began to parse her every word for hypocrisy. The sympathetic press dried up. The vultures descended. I could feel the tide turning in my favor. This was what it meant to hold power, an intoxicating, almost cruel rush. But the thrill had an undercurrent. A sense of a tide that can carry you along and then strand you on jagged rock. The company announced a restructuring. The CEO resigned under pressure from investors who'd been jittery since the scandal. There was a vacuum. An opening for someone with experience and a steady hand to step in and restore confidence. The board wanted a public face who could promise accountability and change. I had been working quietly behind the scenes, networking with directors, offering my insights under pseudonyms, sending memos under the plausible cover of concerned former PR professionals. My public profile had been minimal in the last decade, but my past experience in crisis management was relevant. I'd made it relevant. When a search firm put out an anonymous call for interim leadership, I applied. I crafted my resume to blend humility and competence, to suggest that I had returned to the field to give back, after a sabbatical spent raising a family. It was half truth, half manufacture. But the board didn't care about the origin story. They cared about sales figures and steadiness. I had both prepared and positioned to claim. The interviews were a parade of careful words and rehearsed empathy. I talked about transparency, rebuilding trust, and strict anti-nepotism measures. I spoke the language investors wanted to hear. 2 weeks later, the firm offered me the role, interim head of communications, and with it, control over who got the spotlight and who didn't. When HR called Claire in to tell her she wouldn't be reinstated, there was a moment of stunned silence between them, between the old guard and the young woman they'd chewed up. Claire looked at me across the boardroom, and for a second I thought I saw recognition. Not the recognition of an enemy, it was the recognition of someone who'd been outplayed. "You'll be given support for transition," HR told her. Their voices full of the pity reserved for people who've fallen too far. Support. What a neat little word. They called me a savior in the trade press. PR expert steps in to clean house. They called Claire a cautionary tale. My name was on press releases, in op-eds, in glowing quotes about restoring integrity. My inbox filled with requests for interviews and panel invitations. Parents asked me to speak at fundraisers. The PTA president sent a formal apology for earlier coldness and requested my presence at the next meeting. The community that had once shunned me now embraced me, or at least they embraced the version of me they were told to love. I took Claire's career. Not because I wanted her job title, though it was tempting, but because I wanted to reclaim what she'd taken from me. The sense of power I had when I was a professional woman, not a betrayed wife. I wanted people to watch me succeed and know that I had not been erased. But triumph is complicated. Sitting in my new office, large windows, tasteful artwork, a nameplate that read Emily Carter, interim head of communications, I felt an emptiness that no applause could fill. The seat at Michael's side was empty. He lived in the city now. His life with her had dissolved into something quieter and lonelier than spectacle. Sometimes he called, asking questions about the company, about strategy, and always the underlying plea, "Are you happy?" The truth is, I was satisfied. I had engineered a carefully calibrated retribution. But satisfaction and happiness are different currencies. The next morning I woke up and the house felt too big, like a stage set after midnight. I had revenge, yes, and a new title. I also had a nagging, delicate ache where love had been. Revenge had filled the space he'd left. But revenge is not a home. It's a courtroom victory that echoes in an empty chamber. A year later, Claire reappeared. Not as a supplicant begging for mercy, but as something sharper. She'd started her own boutique consulting firm. An ironic twist. The woman I'd ruined now building a life without the safety net of corporate prestige. She'd taken smaller, scrappier clients, local nonprofits, startups, and she'd worked nights and weekends until she'd salvaged a reputation by sheer force of competence. She wrote a candid piece about burnout and learning from failure. It didn't read like a mea culpa. It read like someone who'd been tempered by fire. When I read it, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. A strange, unexpected respect. Her words were honest, and they were healing in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be. One evening, months after the article, she knocked on my office door. I almost didn't invite her in. She asked for coffee. I said yes. We sat across from each other. Not as enemies but as two women who'd been bent by life into different shapes. For a moment I expected recrimination, for her to call me everything the internet had called me. Instead she said quietly, "You did what you had to do." I bristled. "Did I?" "You defended your life," she said. "In a way my failure taught me how to build a different kind of life. Maybe we're not so different." Her honesty disarmed me. I thought of the nights I'd spent crafting a perfect ruin for her. The small petty pleasures that had felt like nourishment. And I thought of Michael, how little his presence mattered to the person I had become. "What do you want?" I asked. She smiled, sad, rueful. "I want a fair shot. Not revenge. A fair shot." Maybe that was the truest revenge of all, to hold nothing back and then put the weapon down. I never told Claire about the extent of what I'd done. Some confessions are prisons, and I prefer the freedom of secrets. She never mentioned me in interviews except once, in a passing anecdote about failure and resilience. Michael. He remarried a year later. The marriage lasted 3 years. The sparkle eventually dulled, as all things do. I heard through a mutual friend that he missed the woman who'd let him go, but not enough to stop himself. I felt neither triumph nor pity. What I did feel, what I continue to feel occasionally when I catch my reflection and do a double take, is a fierce, complicated power. I learned that people can be taken apart and put back together in different forms. I learned how easily careers can be manufactured and dismantled. I learned that revenge is not cleanliness. It's a mirror held up to one's own capacity for harm. Did I take Claire's career? Yes. Did I feel victorious? In the short term, absolutely. In the long term, the victory was quieter. It was reclaiming my identity, proving to myself that I could still command a room, a narrative, a fate. It was the slow rebuilding of margins I had thought lost. Sometimes at night, when the office is empty and the city hums below, I think about the choices I made. I think about the thin line between justice and cruelty. And I remind myself of the girl who once answered the phone at 2 a.m. and comforted a man who had just betrayed her. I remind myself that she got up, learned tools she had forgotten, and used them with precision. Am I proud? In parts. Am I sorry? In parts. Would I do it again? That depends on the cost. Claire's firm now does well in its niche. She occasionally speaks on panels about professional recovery. I see her name in trade journals and feel a small, complex satisfaction that she built something from the ashes I'd left. She took a different path. I took what she had and made it mine. Then I learned to make something of it that had nothing to do with her. In the end, the world moved on. Scandals burned bright, then faded. Careers rose and fell. People love and betray and sometimes get what they deserve. I walked away with a job, a title, and a ledger of what I'd done. I also walked away with the knowledge that power tastes sharp, and that sometimes the only person who can return you to yourself is the one you thought you'd lost. The last time I saw Michael, he was at a conference speaking about leadership with practiced humility. He caught my eye as he left the stage. Awkward, a little ashamed. I nodded. He didn't approach. I didn't need him to. Because in the quiet afterward, when the applause faded, I knew I had already taken the most important thing back. My story.